firstly, I know there have been absolutely individual senior clerics who have denounced September the 11th, but the fact that there has not been that formal move to gather in convocation, to gather collectively, to ostracize Osama bin Laden, say this is nothing to do with what we're about. You've done it a bit in what you've written, but others, it seems to me, have not done it in that collective way. Inevitably, people are going to think, and most importantly, the millions of people who seem to be supporting it across the Muslim world, for all the reasons we've been talking about, those two things combine to make non-Muslims, who admittedly know all too little about Islam, think maybe there's something Islamic about this rather than just a rogue one-off element.
But I think the media I think the media has some responsibility here, because the media puts a magnifying glass. If you look at Pakistan, a rally of 15,000 people, we could get a rally of the National Front in this country that would have some very extremist views. The same in America. I mean, we could get some very extremist views. If the media shed its light on those groups as somehow being representative of the West, I think people would be horrified in the West. I really think the overwhelming majority of Muslims were as horrified as anybody else, and in some ways more so, because their religion was associated with this. So I can't agree with you.
I just think Jonathan, come back.
It's just the thing that, and again I say it as not as more in sorrow than in anger. I mean, it is something that worries me, because there is that polling, for example, in Pakistan. I too wanted to believe the TV cameras have gone for the handful of people and magnified it. But there's polling that shows 80+% support for Osama bin Laden. Not actually, you're right, for the specific action of September the 11th.
They don't, I would say, first of all, that most people in the non-Arab world, they don't understand. He speaks in Arabic. They don't know really what he's saying. They see him, he's a very romantic character. He's wearing the traditional garb of righteousness and piety. They see him as a man who gave up $300 million to live in a cave, to sacrifice for righteous cause. He was seen as a freedom fighter by the Reagan administration back in the 80s, and he was a hero in Saudi Arabia for doing what he did in repelling the evil empire from Afghanistan. So I think that people have a hard time dealing with the fact that somebody could go down the wrong path.
What about that formal denunciation, though, that kind of...
I think there has been. I really do, and I think that it's unfair to say that there hasn't been. There has been a formal denunciation. I think, unfortunately, there is elements within the Muslim world. I'll give you an example. A Saudi Arabian friend of mine said that he was asked by somebody, what was the initial reaction? And he said the initial reaction was, in a sense, some people had this initial reaction of, you know, yes, this is a good thing. And he said, but when the contorted faces of the victims came, it came home to them. It wasn't a video game. It wasn't a film. It was something very profoundly horrifying. And I think that they were shocked. So there is, unfortunately, in the Muslim world, there is a sense that they're at the brunt of misguided foreign policies. There is a lot of aggression towards America. I'm not going to deny that.
I think theologically, it's quite clear that anyone that tries to use Islam to commit terrorist acts is entering the field of heresy. The Quranic injunctions against the Quranic injunctions for the conduct of any sort of aggression or war are very, very clear. There must never be any non-combatants killed. War must be declared. Women and children must be protected. And this is, I mean, is far, far more clearly expressed in the Quran than it ever is in either the Jewish or the Christian scriptures. And so to try and use Islam as and the Quran as a legitimizer of terrorist acts is simply heresy. I mean, Hamza knows this better than I do.
Absolutely.
But I think you're missing the point here. I don't think the issue is theological. The issue is political. And all of this debate is predicated on the notion that we know what terrorism is. Most Muslims would actually argue, the first point, well, what actually constitutes terrorism? Is terrorism simply a euphemism for what the United States or its allies do not like, political violence they do not like? Or is it actually something more substantive? And that's the first argument. Yes. That whenever you actually put this point to them, the first thing they come up with is a series of, well, what about? The 500,000 people who are dying in Iraq because of the sanctions regimes, the fact there's daily bombing in Iraq. What about all the Palestine? What about Kashmir? I mean, you could go through this very kind of long list. So the question is this about terrorism? Then what is the definition of terrorism? And this is where I think we really reach a point here. Is there actually agreed definition of terrorism which transcends simply the United States and its allies. And these allies also include the governments and the senior ulama to some extent. That's why you don't get these kind of idea of holding a convocation where everyone will come together and denounce it. It won't make any difference because Muslim people are not stupid necessarily. In a sense, they realize that these governments speak for themselves, or they are actually, many of these governments are heavily implicated. And just because a fatwa is issued by somebody, it doesn't necessarily speak to that experience. Now, the people in Pakistan who are protesting, they know that 2 years ago when Musharraf came to power, both Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were demanding return to democracy. But they now think that it's very unlikely that Tony Blair or George Bush are asking Musharraf to have a democratic election right now at this moment. Now, that's not stupidity, it seems to me. I think it's quite clear why they know that. And I think we tend to overestimate this kind of, because, you know, these people don't have the kind of privileges of the education of the first world, etc., that these people don't know anything. They actually do know it because they live at the sharp end of it.
I understand all that, and I think you can hold simultaneously in your head an awareness of the suffering at the hands of American foreign policy, etc., of the vast swathes of the Muslim world, and believe that it's a pretty clear case of terrorism when a building with 6,000 people in it gets hit with a view to everyone in it dying. And what I suppose, in a way, I was looking for was, if there was somebody who had done that or ordered that in the name of Judaism, my guess is that the Jewish world would gather to denounce that person for the reason Hamza says, which is, don't steal our religion and abuse it in this way. Similarly, I would hope in the Christian world there'd be a similar reaction.
Barak Goldstein is considered a hero among some extremists.
Against some, absolutely, amongst some extremists, but formally by the rest of the rabbinic establishment, he's been denounced.
But every
that's what I'm saying about the Muslims.
Countries condemned these bombings.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it's only extremists.
Well, you use the word, the fatwa. Why, for example, can there not be a fatwa against Osama bin Laden? Would that not
there has been
hundreds of fatwas.
Hundreds of fatwas.
A formal fatwa against Osama bin Laden?
There'll be hundreds of fatwas.
Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's one of the most respected amongst particularly younger people, came out. Many of the scholars have denounced. Absolutely. Al-Azhar, which is considered very representative of the scholastic tradition in Islam, came out with complete condemnation, fatwas. Nobody has justified this theologically. I think, unfortunately, there has been emotional justification for it, which shouldn't be seen as intellectual or theological.
But I think the important point to remember here is this, that when we're dealing with world politics, the exercise of great power isn't just the ability to use force. It's actually to make that force look just and legitimate. And that is one of the kind of questions that, you know, the United States keeps running into. This war against terrorism, the first victims of the events after the 11th of September were Muslims or Sikhs who were considered to look like Muslims. So when, for example, you have a war against terrorism and Muslim cemeteries are desecrated, again, you don't... Why is this the case? Are you looking for terrorists in cemeteries? No. So obviously there's a connection that is made implicitly, which everyone understands, even though there's a war against terrorism.
Can we talk about your views, all your views, on the position of fundamentalism, if I can use that word, inside Islam, and to take what Jonathan said a stage further, because I think it's a very fair point. How is it regarded?
I have a problem with the word. It's a 19th century word that was used to describe reformist movements within Protestant Christianity. In Islam, fundamentalism, the word in Arabic is actually a very high word. It has to do with building based on sound fundamentals or principles. Extremism, however, is a word I think that is more useful. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, beware of extremism. The Quran actually says to the Christians and the Jews, do not go to extremes in your religion. So the Quran actually tells Jews and Christians not to go to extremes. So it becomes troublesome when there are Muslims who their own book tells other religions not to be extremists, when they begin to become extremists. So I think that extremism is the problem. It's a human problem. I think that it exists, it's a human tendency. Extreme circumstances breed extremism, as in Nazi Germany. But I think that in terms of the theology of it, there is a crisis in Islam right now, which is how do we legitimize religious authority. This was not a problem 100 years ago because the institutions for legitimizing authority were still very much intact. They were literally dismantled by the colonial enterprise.
I think there's also a political edge to this as well. I mean, one of the things happened in 1924, the Khalifa was abolished by Mustafa Kemal.
Can you just explain what that means?
The Khalifa was basically the authorized political leadership of the Muslim world, or it claimed to be that anyway, and it was more or less recognized. So there was a template for Muslims at what kind of political authority they should be, and that was to live under a Khalifa, and then you could worry about what was a good or a bad Khalifa, but that was more or less the template. Now, with the abolition of that, you suddenly have an explosion of political theory. How should Muslims live? In what kind of political arrangements are necessary for Muslims? And that is what you're seeing is actually the politicization of those questions. And that's why, while I accept exactly what Hamza is saying about the theological influences, there's also a political imperative that for Muslims, how to live, like any other society, how to live in a good society. What is the idea of a good society? When you no longer have a sanctified answer to that, you then start having attempts to try and construct this. This is why, for example, the movements, all of these movements that people call fundamentalists, what they really want is an Islamic order. Now, what that actually means in practice varies greatly from place to place. And why people actually, to some extent, follow them, because for them, Islamic order simply means a just order or good governance. Now, it's the practice of putting that there, putting it into place, which becomes very, very complicated.
This strikes me as very interesting, because it seems to me there may be an answer here to my earlier question, because if one of the problems which both of you are describing in the Muslim world is an absence of an accepted authority system of a kind that I would understand in the Christian world, for example, then maybe the individuals you named are able to fire off these fatwas, but they're not universally accepted in the way that I would understand maybe applying a kind of more formal hierarchical model from some of the other of the world's great religions. But it seems to me this might be a wider problem for Islam, that it doesn't have there's a leadership vacuum, is in a way what you're describing.
No, this is a major problem. Another aspect that a lot of people aren't aware of is that traditionally in the Muslim world, the best intellects went to Islamic studies and theology, just as in the West. Now, we still have quite significant training, theological training in the West here. I mean, we have some very serious Christian thinkers still. However, in the Muslim world, the vast majority of intellects now go to medicine, go to engineering, and these type of elements.
It is the result of that the kind of collective ostracism of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, that in a way, and I think a lot of people in the West are looking for, is actually impossible to ask for from the Muslim world.
Well, there's no such unity of the Muslim world. I mean, firstly, even if you had, I mean, why isn't there a Muslim unified speaker? You assume that if there was a Muslim leadership, it would be a leadership that actually would collaborate and would actually be able to cooperate.
Yeah. As a crude analogy, like a paper.
But not only the papacy, the priesthood in Islam.
I think, yeah.
No, but there was, even though there wasn't a priesthood.
Last time there was a de facto. Last time there was a de facto leadership, in a sense, was Ayatollah Khomeini. And the problem here was this, and he certainly had his supporters outside the Shia circles. So the problem here comes down to it is this: is it possible to imagine a leadership of the Muslim world, which will be recognized as a leadership of the Muslim world by non-Muslims, which can also be anti-Western, for example, can say, well, actually, we don't agree with the foreign policies and things like that. And these are the kind of complicating issues that you can't keep removing this question simply to instances of what the texts say or what happens in theology. These are actually political questions which are politically founded.
I agree with that too, but I'm afraid it's one of the other things I've sort of picked up in just conversations I've had. The sense I'm getting is a lot of clerics or theologians or students of this would make a theological judgment similar to the one you made, which is that it's a gross distortion, etc., but feel frightened for political reasons of saying that, because they do not want to be on the wrong side of what is a growing trend, particularly among the young of the Arab and Muslim world, and they do not want to be less radical than the man who's now the current champion of this movement.
Okay, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. We haven't quite finished talking about the fundamentalist issue, so let's just spend a few more moments on that. Given the scholarship, the leadership in a theologically guided society have been, as it were, not wiped out, but almost wiped out over the last 100 years. Given that, do you think that that has allowed free rein to the fundamentalists, and that they are now the driving force? There is, I'm sorry to be, nothing to stop them. They are taking over, and if that's right, what are they doing with this takeover?
I don't think they are the driving force, to be honest with you. I think Oliver Roy's book, The Failure of Political Islam, is an important book in that he was already seeing the decline of this. Unfortunately, this situation that we're in now is, in a sense, reviving this, which to me is tragic. I think that the vast majority of Muslims are a silent majority. They haven't stood up and been counted. But I really do feel that the majority of Muslims are as troubled and frightened as well by what's happening as Western people. I really believe that.
But it does seem to the West, and a lot is, you know, we all know that things exist on perception as well as reality. It does seem to people in the West, and maybe the media is distorting it, and so on and so on and so forth. Never mind, it does seem to us that when we see what is going on, it is the fundamentalists that we're seeing. That's a fundamentalist agenda. Now, is that completely wrong?